right, well, thank you everybody for coming today, and thank you to CTSI for inviting me to talk about expanded access and really focusing on single patient investigational use of drugs, including emergency use. So for those of you who don't know me, my name's Kristen Bussey. I'm a pharmacist sorry, I had a pop-up join here. Pharmacist by training. I am an assistant professor in the School of Pharmacy, but the major portion of my appointment is really in the Office of Research, where I run a regulatory affairs program and help advise on IND and IDE applications and facilitate those submissions to the FDA, as well as chair a couple of committees, IRB committees as well. So what we're going to talk about is, like I said, the expanded access process and how we handle it from my perspective as an IRB chair, and then what those regulatory requirements are as well. So I've intentionally kept this short. There's only maybe about 22 slides or so. So certainly would love to keep this interactive. Feel free to unmute and interrupt me as we go. If you prefer the chat, Sarah has the chat brought up so that we can keep an eye on that. Otherwise, of course, we can answer questions at the end as well. So if I can navigate the slides here. There we go. So objectives today. Basic principles related to expanded access and understanding the difference between a single patient IND versus an emergency use IND. Going to take a look at what documents are required both for the FDA and for our internal IRB. And then what else is important after you've obtained that IND and start treating that patient? What are the regulatory requirements to maintain those submissions? So first we have a poll, and Sarah said she is going to launch it on Zoom for us. So the first one being, do you know what expanded access is? And have you ever helped with an expanded access request before? Just to give us a little lay of the land on who's attending today. And I think I can share this with everybody. Okay, this is where we're at. So let's know what this is.
So we've got about, I'm going to end the poll and I think I can share the results then with everybody. There we go.
Yeah. So a lot of people understand, what expanded access is. That's great. A handful also don't. And then only a few people have helped with an expanded access request. So hopefully this is useful information for you today to begin to understand. It's kind of, basic understanding. Certainly there's a lot of moving pieces that's involved in expanded access. All right, so we can skip past those. So to get to that first question, what is expanded access? It's certainly a term that's thrown out there quite a bit. Can probably have heard of it as expanded access, compassionate use, single patient expanded access, emergency use. Any number of terms can be described by this same process. And basically what we're talking about is when there is an investigational, and I'm specifically talking about drugs in this presentation, not devices. Devices are a whole other can of worms for another topic. But expanded access to investigational drugs involves the use of an unapproved drug that is being requested and used outside of the setting of a clinical trial. So the important thing really to really start your brain working about it is it's not research. although it's very much handled like research. So that's where it gets really confusing, because the FDA really needed a pathway to give patients and physicians and their healthcare providers access to these investigational therapies. But they needed some way to kind of monitor that, so that because they're not FDA approved, it's really intended to treat patients with those serious or immediately life-threatening diseases where they've already basically tried everything else. And this is their last-ditch effort to continue to live their life without severe morbidity or, ultimately mortality. So through the years, and even I've seen it in my time here since I started at Freighter in 2008, they've come a long way, the FDA has, in what they do in order to support this process from that federal level. And so I think along with that, we've seen here at our institution progress along the way, and we try to keep up with what the FDA is doing so that we're not a barrier on the IRB side or any of those approvals. We're not the barrier to the patients and the physicians receiving these drugs. So really, it's intended to improve this access to investigational therapies who have a chance of benefiting from that therapy. So there's different types of expanded access. I'm going to briefly go through what the requirements are, what the regulatory requirements are for all 3 different types, or 4 if you count emergency use separate. So one we already covered. It's the intent is to treat a serious or immediately life-threatening disease, and we don't have any satisfactory alternative therapy that is currently approved or available. And whether that's to diagnose, monitor, or treat the disease or condition. Typically, what we're talking about here is treating with an investigational drug. The FDA wants the assurance that the potential benefit outweighs the potential risks. So again, you get into that research like terminology, where we in the IRB office are always talking about whether the risk-benefit ratio is balanced sufficiently enough that we think that the benefit outweighs the risks. And then we want to make sure that those risks aren't unreasonable in the context of the disease or condition to be treated. So kind of getting at the toxicity end of things and making sure that, the potential toxicity of that drug is going to harm the patient more than if they use that drug to treat the patient. And then finally, since we are talking about unapproved medications, there's a need to assure the FDA that this use of this drug outside the context of a clinical trial isn't going to interfere with the sponsor's marketing or commercialization of that drug. It's not going to interfere with the usual process to how the FDA reviews the safety and efficacy of all drugs that are on the market in the US. So like I mentioned too, we have different types of expanded access. And so what we're going to focus on today is the single patient, which is one of the more frequent types of requests that we see come through. We also have the intermediate size and the treatment population. So it's basically small, medium, large, if you want to think about it that way. Single patient, intermediate size, there's no definition of what intermediate size is. And then finally, treatment population or treatment IND, that's usually what you can think of as like an open label access study, that a subject who's enrolled on a clinical trial has completed that clinical trial, and now they roll over to receive that same drug that the study was investigating. They continue to receive it from the sponsor, and they can do that sometimes until the drug's approved and commercially available. So that's one type of treatment population if you're curious. But like I said, we're not going to focus on that today, really focusing more on the emergency use and the non-emergency use or treatment use. So I will use these terms kind of interchangeably here. So we have those initial criteria that apply to all of the different types of expanded access. Each different type then has additional criteria. So for single patient treatment use, non-emergency use, the additional criteria is that, again, the physician has to determine that the risk doesn't exceed that of the disease for the patient. And then there has to be no available clinical trial open for that patient to enroll in that study, or they don't qualify for that clinical trial. That's kind of what we see a little bit more frequently, is that there's a reason why they don't qualify for a clinical trial that might be open in the area. So then the additional safeguards we have in place for the single patient treatment is that typically the FDA says it's generally limited to a single course of therapy, but more and more, especially on the oncology side of things, we're seeing, or the antibiotics or anti-fungals that we've seen come through, they're being used for longer periods of time. And as long as the FDA has reviewed what that treatment plan is and, kind of identified how long that course of treatment is, that's fine. They're not going to deny it because it's longer than a single course of treatment. The additional safeguards, and I'll get into this a little bit more at the end about reporting. So there is a requirement, if it does continue for greater than a year, that there's an annual report that summarizes that treatment of that patient, if there's been any toxicities and any changes that have happened over that year. So that report has to go to the FDA as well as the IRB. And then finally, we saw this with convalescent plasma early in the pandemic, where when there was a number of requests to the FDA for similar or the same access to the treatment, then they could request somebody to submit or open up either a intermediate size or a large treatment IND, because they're just inundated with those single patient requests. And so we did see that in Mayo, and a couple other groups opened up expanded access, as did we here locally for convalescent plasma. So transitioning now over to the requirements for emergency use. So again, this is in the single patient treatment. That's emergency use is only ever going to be for a single patient treatment. And that's basically the situation arises where you need to start treatment immediately. And it's before you can get all your documents together and submit everything prospectively, both to FDA and IRB. That's the original intent of emergency use. You can kind of see as oncology has really pushed what that time frame is, because if you think about it, it's a little bit different if you have a patient who's failed all of their therapies for their cancer, but in a couple of weeks, there could be very detrimental ramifications of no treatment. That could be plenty of time for you to go through and get a prospective approval of the single patient IND, but still it's an emergency for that patient to begin treatment as soon as possible. And so what I'm trying to get at here is that it's a fine line between emergency use and a single patient treatment IND. And my best recommendation is really to reach out to the IRB office, reach out to those partners to discuss the criteria and when treatment really needs to begin and what they have in place. So as far as the criteria, the regulatory criteria for use is that, like I said, it's a life-threatening condition that needs immediate treatment. There's, again, no generally acceptable alternative treatment, and there's no time to follow those prospective procedures to obtain IRB and FDA approval. So that's when you pick up the phone and call FDA, you pick up the phone and call IRB in the reverse order. And then subsequently, you submit all your documents to the FDA within the 15 working days. And then our institutional requirements and federal requirements include submitting that eBridge application within 5 working days of the treatment use. And then it's a single IRB chair or a designee from that committee that reviews the application and can approve it. There's something else I'm going to say, but I can't remember now. So moving on here. So as far as kind of those differences, to highlight them side by side, for emergency use, like I said, we have to make sure that the time is of the essence and you need to start that treatment as soon as possible. That treatment can begin really as soon as you get the okay from the FDA and the drug from the sponsor. Whereas in the non-emergency use, it may take up to 30 days because a single patient IND is still considered an IND in the FDA eyes. I've never seen it take 30 days. We're still looking at typically 1 to 2 days for the FDA to send an email that issues that single patient treatment IND in a non-emergency use situation. In both situations, now that the policies have been updated, a single individual, either the IRB chair or designee, can review and approve both of these types of uses of investigational therapy. And again, just reaching out and working with the IRB office is usually the best first step to get you on your way. Mm-hmm.
For emergency use, what happens after hours? Is there a hotline to the IRB or the FDA, or?
Yes, for emergency use, the FDA has after hours phone number. They have somebody on call for emergency use purposes, and they have it stratified a little bit differently. So there's one contact for oncology products and one contact for everything else. And I didn't include that in these slides, but I certainly can put that contact information in there if anybody's interested in it. And then since, after hours, so I mean, if you're thinking that this is seriously, the patient is going to die before you can reach out to the IRB office, clearly the regulations allow for that. Yep. All right. So just a little bit about the intermediate size as far as the additional criteria goes. So since you're treating a little bit more, a little bit larger population size, so this is, more than one patient, but less than, who knows what, several 100,000, whatever it might be, with the larger treatment IND, they want some assurance that the drug is safe at the dose that you are going to give to those patients. And that there's at least some preliminary evidence that it's plausible that this drug is going to work in that specific disease state. So where we've seen these is typically in rare conditions where they've started development of the drug, but then stopped for whatever reason, whether that's business related or not. And then we also have to consider those patients, again, who might not be eligible to enroll in a clinical trial. So they open up an expanded access that's a slightly different demographic. And then we've also seen its use in drugs that were initially approved for one indication, but then taken off the market. It's still around, but they want a little bit more control around it because of some toxicity that's associated with the drug. So
no anecdotal evidence.
Correct.
I feel so.
Yeah.
No,
At least phase 1. Yeah, and then finally the large population. Again, FDA has to be assured that there's no controlled clinical trials that's the drug has to be involved in controlled clinical trials to support marketing, or all of those clinical trials of the drug have been completed. So this is what I was talking about with those open label expanded access rollover studies, where you just stay on that part of the study until the drug is commercially available. And they need assurance that the sponsor's pursuing marketing approval, and that, again, building on that safety and efficacy. Typically this is like after phase 3 data is available, or those phase 3 studies have sufficient evidence to to promote its use. So I mentioned a little bit that we had some policy updates in the IRB office. I think the biggest update here is that the previous policy required the full IRB committee review for single patient expanded access. But since I mentioned the FDA has made those changes to ease the burden to access these investigational agents, they are allowing the use of this FDA form 3926. You submit that to the FDA. You have to check this this box on the form that requests the waiver of the full IRB review. And then that allows the IRB office to assign it to a single reviewer. And previously it was a little bit more complicated than that, not so straightforward and clear. So they've done a good job of providing that update from the FDA perspective. So as far as like what the procedure would be in a non-emergency use situation, picking up the phone, calling the HRPP or the IRB office regarding the proposed treatment, certainly not forgetting to also reach out to your clinical partners with OCRC and the Investigational Drug Pharmacy Service at Freighter, if you're working there, to let them know that this is coming, early notice, even if you're thinking about it, because not just at our institution, but I was just on a call with other CTSI institutions talking about expanded access. And everybody reports these happen on Fridays and usually before a holiday. So if you've been thinking about it that whole week and you've heard some rumors about, yeah, we're looking into this, just, shooting that quick email or picking up the phone or whatever the best method is for you, just to alert some people that things might be rolling along, and then obviously updating as more information is known. That's definitely appreciated by everybody. So, we've talked about the IRB office and the FDA, but, clearly sponsor is, how do you access the investigational drug? And so the way to do that is actually contacting, it has to be listed on the sponsor's website, whether they offer access to that investigational medication and how to contact them. So you contact them, you ask them if they're willing to provide the drug, if it's available for expanded access. And then secondly, there's kind of two different paths. You can either have the sponsor work with the FDA on your behalf, or if they decline, then your treating physician becomes the sponsor investigator. And so they're the ones who has to call the FDA. And that's typically what we usually see in most situations, that your treating physician then becomes the sponsor investigator. So then at that point, that's when you need to have a letter from the sponsor that allows the FDA to look at all of the data that they have under that existing IND for the FDA to approve this new IND. Even though it's for a single patient, that's the approval process to get access. So the sponsor can actually ship the drug to you under that IND. And then finally, the last piece would be to open that treatment use application in eBridge and fill out the contents of that eBridge application. So as far as documents that are required, the FDA, when you talk to them, will then follow up with an acknowledgement letter that includes, that includes the IND number that's assigned to that specific patient. You also need to consent the patient, and either the sponsor could have a treatment use template if they provide their drug, or if there isn't one available from the sponsor, there certainly is a treatment use template available on the HRPP website. And then we need some sort of communication from the sponsor of the approval of the use of that investigational product. And then finally, the completed FDA 3926 that was submitted to the FDA, because that includes also that box that the IRB office needs to check to make sure it's filled out completely. So then emergency use is usually just quicker. So contacting the HRPP office, contacting the FDA. FDA can issue an IND over the phone and follow up with documentation after the fact. But usually, then you need to still have that assurance from the sponsor that they're going to provide the drug, and you need that letter of authorization. So that's where we're seeing the sticking point now, is actually the sponsor taking a little bit longer to respond to those requests. And so then finally the eBridge application we've mentioned. So similar documents are required for review for an emergency use situation. I mentioned the IND number might come in an email communication. There is actually an emergency use template available on the HRPP website under the emergency use website. That's kind of its standalone tab on the website. And then something to keep in mind too, in the situation where a patient is unresponsive and they don't have any family around, so there's no legally authorized representative, or the LAR isn't available. That's when you have to have a second physician who's not otherwise involved in the patient's care, basically agree that the patient meets the definition of emergency use and there's no time to contact the LAR. And then that needs to be part of the submission to the FDA. So like I said, for FDA submission, it's after the fact. So within 15 working days of the use of the investigational agent, that's when the completed 3926 needs to be submitted. You don't have to select the 10B because emergency use doesn't fall under that prospective review. So you don't need to request that waiver. It's already built into the regulations as they're written. Other accompanying documentation include the physician CV and then also the letter of authorization from the sponsor. Okay, so now that all of that was the initial access to the investigational agent. So now kind of what are the follow-up requirements after that initial? How do you maintain compliance with the FDA regulations? So if it's the situation where your treating physician has contacted the FDA, that's when they're considered the sponsor investigator. And then all of the sponsor responsibilities that are outlined in the regulations under INDs, which is in 21 CFR 312, that physician is required to follow those. And so I'm highlighting here what those requirements are and trying to simplify it a little bit. So it might sound daunting that now you're the sponsor, but really it's using that same 3926 form and submitting additional information back to the FDA. And so that would be at the time of different points in the course of the patient being treated. So I've laid out this table here where we have the action on the left-hand side of the table includes what the FDA is expecting. So they're expecting a safety report as soon as possible when anything happens that requires reporting to the FDA under the regulations. And so the unexpected fatal or life-threatening adverse drug reactions, they have to go in within 7 days after the physician hears about it. And then anything that would be considered serious or unexpected has to go within 15 calendar days. There's certainly more guidance out there related to what exactly would would be considered serious and unexpected. And so I've listed those guidances there in the regulations as well. So if there's any change to the treatment plan, that would be considered an amendment. So that can go through on the 3926, which has a section that includes what treatment is being provided and what the plan is. So that needs to go into both the FDA and the IRB. And then finally, the last two things. So when the treatment is complete, the FDA wants a summary of what happened. You know, did they tolerate the treatment? Were there any adverse events? Why did they stop treatment? What's happening with the patient? On the flip side, if the treatment extends past a year, they want an annual report. So the summary would basically withdraw the IND because it's done, but the annual report keeps the IND open. And so the annual report is just something for the lifetime, over a year, the lifetime of that IND being effective, that needs to happen on an annual basis. And then after that point, then the summary would go in and withdrawal of the IND.
Link again.
And then for what the IRB would expect to see with all of these different actions that I went through. So this is kind of the comparison of, you know, this is the FDA action on the first column on the left, and then how the IRB would expect to see that reported in eBridge. So, and then I've included what documents for IRB review would be needed. And so safety reports, we're looking for a MedWatch form, that communication to the FDA, the updated treatment plan for an amendment. The final report would be opened as far as the summary goes of the completion of treatment. And then an annual report would be filed as a CPR. So I believe that's all I have here. And I just wanted to open it up to see what your experience is, what questions you have related to those experiences. Those few folks who did join us and said they have done this before, is there anything I'm missing that you think is vitally important for folks to understand?
Also, just to share your experience, how did it go? Were there glitches? What can others learn? So one thing that you said, the emergency use thing was either it's N of 1, otherwise then it falls under the intermediate category. So if there are like 2 patients, then even then it's like intermediate?
So emergency use is a little bit different. I didn't bring up the requirement that FDA used to lay out there. It's still written that after a product's been used at your institution for an emergency use situation, then after that, you need to open up an intermediate use protocol for any future use. So they certainly encourage that if you can anticipate, you know, that you would want repeated use. And, you know, we alluded to that already.
Right.
But they're not going to deny
Okay.
a second use in emergency use situation. Yeah, they'll just be coming back saying you need to open up a treatment use, kind of like we saw with convalescent plasma. So one question we had is kind of what's the difference between off-label use and access in this regard? So one way to answer that question would be, so if you think about off-label use, that's with a currently marketed FDA treatment that is available, and the physician is going to use it off-label. So that is within the purview of the care of that physician. That falls under the practice of medicine. And so there's no need, if you're not, creating a clinical trial where you want to investigate something that's different than its approved use, or, changing the dose or the route or something like that. But in this situation, what we're talking about are investigational medications that aren't FDA approved. So the only way to get them would be directly through the sponsor. You can't get it through your pharmacy or other distributors. So feel free to unmute if I didn't answer that sufficiently. And then it is the second comment was about having a treatment plan to submit to the FDA. And that's really important, that you can't just say we want this drug for this patient without explaining, both the history of how we got here. What are all those, different options that were available that the patient tried and failed? But then also, what's the plan to treat them, as far as what's the dose, duration, how long are they going to receive it? And then how frequently are they coming into clinic for those follow-up visits, so that they have their safety labs drawn, they have their physician assessments, making sure that they're keeping an eye on them. And that's information that both FDA and the IRB would want, those details. And that's included in the eBridge form, so it lays it out there pretty explicitly. Thanks for those questions.
On a larger scale, it got me wondering. So, I'm sure, this is not something routine that happens anyways, but the FDA must have a database of all emergency uses that have occurred. I wonder if someone's looking at that to explore more systematic clinical trials for those drugs, for those uses.
Yeah, that's an interesting thought.
We are in a world where pharma especially is just trying to reuse all the drugs and see other indications. I wonder if someone's looking at that. It could be really high impact if it works in a larger setting.
Right. I wonder anybody in the companies themselves, the sponsors and their business development departments, seeing if they're analyzing that on a regular basis. That's a good question, because I know, clearly they have to submit all of their data annually and include that data from expanded access. And
so, at least you would have something to go on for a proof of trial. You'd have at least that much data.
Yeah, and it kind of also depends on what the requirements are of the sponsor for data collection. Right. So that's kind of where you get into that gray zone of, well, if the sponsor is asking for this data, that kind of sounds a little bit more like research rather than expanded access. So I think that's maybe a fine line to walk there.
And, now trials of N of 1 are, NIH is really pushing for that.
With rare diseases.
With rare diseases. And this is basically N of 1, but not that whole study design where you do have to have crossover and assignments. But still, it's something to explore, I think. If an investigator is really invested and there is effect, it could get interesting.
Yeah, it could be good hypothesis generating.
Companies. Anything else? All right.
Well, thank you all. I appreciate the time. Hopefully the silence doesn't mean it just went over your head. I'm sure it doesn't. But certainly if you have any more questions, I think I had my contact information here. So happy to answer any questions as they come along. Otherwise, like I mentioned before, great resources available at our institution, both in the IRB office and OCRIC and the Investigational Drugs Service, you know, all key players and a part of this process also. So thank you all.
Excellent. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Kristen, for coming and appreciate it. And everyone, please, if you could fill out those surveys, we really appreciate that. And we really change our content based on what you guys write to us. So we're always looking forward to those. And we'll see you until next time.
Thank you so much. Yeah, we appreciate, we have a lot of folks that are coming to a lot of the sessions, so we're always happy to see you again.